Human interaction with art is a very intimate process. People will probably have their own answers, and these answers will be numerous. There will be no one reaction. We, of course, have testimonies or documents, but they are always given in one language. A person tells a testimony in the language that he understands, and then translating it always loses something of the message, because a testimony is not only the words but also the voice, also the tone, also the emotions that are there. So we think art is this new way or different way of telling the story of Auschwitz, which is very universal in terms of the language. Because no matter if you are from here, from Philadelphia, or you are from West or East Coast, or from the United States, or you will have visitors from any other country, art is universal. The story of Auschwitz is directly linked with the story of the Second World War. On September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland, which was the beginning of the conflict. Then, of course, we have the Soviet Union entering from the east, and Poland being occupied by two totalitarian regimes. And at the very beginning, what we can see in the occupied situation is that the Germans are trying to do two strategic things. One thing is to destroy Poland as a state. The second is to destroy Poles as a nation. From the very beginning, we can see that the Germans had lists of people that they wanted to arrest, eliminate, and also execute. And within the first few weeks and months of the occupation, we can see this wave of violence going through the Polish occupied territories, with really thousands and thousands of people that are targeted. And they targeted people that we can call the leadership. So, of course, administration and politicians, but also teachers, professors, lawyers, clergy, doctors, journalists, Boy Scouts. These people are put into prisons, and very quickly the prisons were overcrowded. And the Germans had a problem because they couldn't continue to work this way. And this is when an idea to create a concentration camp, a new concentration camp. So they simply decided to open a new one. They found the location, the buildings of the former army base near the city of Oświęcim. The name of the town was translated into Auschwitz. This is the historical German translation. So the new concentration camp that they were planning to open was created there in spring of 1940. The first group of victims are Polish political prisoners, of course, from the first transport in 14th of June 1940, and then the story of Auschwitz slowly develops. This is basically the changes going between 1941 and 1942. But so the camp first developed a technique of killing people using pesticide called Cyclone B, and they created a small gas chamber in Auschwitz to kill groups of prisoners and some of the local Jews from local ghettos or slave labor camps. But when the Nazi regime started coordinating the operation of murder of European Jews, they had a camp which had already developed a technique, and they designated Auschwitz to be one of the extermination centers. So from March of 1942, we have a different kinds of transports coming to Auschwitz, not transport of people who are targeted, persecuted, and they're sent to the concentration camp to become prisoners, slave laborers who were supposed to die eventually. But they started sending Jewish men, women, and children to be exterminated in gas chambers. And because they needed slave labor at some point, they decided that they will be selecting the Jews who are deported, that some of them can become prisoners. And so the youngest and the fittest were selected to become prisoners of the camp. And they somehow joined the story of the Auschwitz as a concentration camp, but vast majority of them, those people were sent straight to the gas chambers. So from that moment, we have Auschwitz having two missions. A concentration camp, which is more linked to the whole terror regime in occupied Poland and also later occupied Europe, because we have many different groups of non-Jews who are deported to Auschwitz. There is a story of Soviet prisoners of war who are also deported to Auschwitz, and most of them did not survive. But of course, we have the second function, which is extermination of Jews in the gas chambers. And out of 1.3 million people who were deported to Auschwitz, 1.1 million were Jewish, and 90% of the victims of the camp were Jewish. Most of these people never became prisoners of the concentration camp. Forbidden Art exhibition shows artworks created by prisoners of the camp, and most of them are artists. So we can see that artists are among those people who are targeted initially, And so here we have them becoming prisoners of Auschwitz. And because they had certain skills, the SS starts using them to do different things in camp offices, to draw plans, to create kind of a models of development. And also they use prisoners, artists, to do some private artworks for them. Some landscapes that they can put into their offices, some portraits that they can send to their families. So this is the official art of dehumanization, art that the perpetrators are using. So artists who are persecuted and whose talents are used to somehow to benefit the regime. But this gives those people opportunity to steal some painting materials, to access to paper, paints, pencils, charcoal, and they start creating art which was forbidden, art which was illegal, art which on one hand could help them keep their own humanity in the world of dehumanization, in the world of the concentration camp, and on the other hand, to document what was happening in the camp. They became, of course, eyewitnesses of what was happening, but their talents as artists can help us today understand a little bit more of the very complex story of the Auschwitz camp. So creating art was not exactly forbidden, as I said. So art made in Auschwitz can be divided into two categories. We have art that is official, art which is commissioned by the SS. So artists can create, having specific orders given by the SS. And there's also art which is forbidden, which is illegal. This is art that shows the reality of the camp. This is art that shows the cruelty of the terror system that was implemented there. This is art that shows death or gas chambers or extermination, of starvation or pain, loneliness and so on. So this is something that the SS didn't want to be documented in any way. And also something that they try to do is to save faces and names and individual people. The concentration camp is all about dehumanization. People became numbers. People were reduced to nothing. People's heads were shaved. People lost their identity as individual, independent people. And artists, by drawing portraits, by creating this individual documents showing human faces, showing their eyes and emotions in their faces, they could also save this individuality. So in a way, art in their hands became a tool of resistance. And anything that was human, anything that would help people stay human in the reality of the concentration camp was forbidden by the SS. We will never know the full scale and stories of artists and art in Auschwitz. We need to remember that we know some works that survived, and the Auschwitz Memorial Collection says approximately 2,000 works of art created in the camp. We also have other artworks that were later created by the survivors, but we also need to remember that there is a completely different part of the story which we'll never know. Because we will never know how many artists created, how many artworks were created in the camp. We have what we have. We have something that survived. And we also have testimonies of some of the artists that managed to survive the war and survive the camps. And they tell about this experience. They tell about why they created. And one of the motives that I think is very important is that they did it to survive themselves. That their talents and their possibility of drawing kept them human in this inhuman world, kept them sane in the world of dehumanization. So they use it, first of all, as their own remedy, their own and a way out from the world into which they were thrown in. But of course, later we can see that these artists also see that they can have a role, that they can use their skills to show the reality of the camp, to save something for us, for the future generations, that maybe thanks to their skills, the people who will come after, people who will be after them when the war is over, when the world will be again free, they will be able to understand what happened. So on one hand, they did it to stay alive, they did it to save themselves and save their sanity, but also many of them took upon themselves a mission, and they became witnesses, and they started documenting, and they used art as their way of testifying about what they saw. And because we do not really have a lot of the visual material. The photographs taken by the SS authorities is a very limited collection, and actually the photographs, because of the secrecy, doesn't really show the harsh reality of the concentration camp. The works of art that survived is this window we can open and we can look inside. But we need to remember that there is another window which is completely dark, that we'll never understand. And there is also another part of the story, because we are talking here about those artists who became prisoners of the camp. And of course, at the very beginning of the camp, there will be mainly Polish prisoners. Later, among the other transports, there were many Jews, but there are also some Roma, some Russians. We also know that there was kind of a creative world, and their stories. But also, when we talk about the story of the extermination of the Jews, we also need to remember that there were many artists who were among people who were deported, and they never became prisoners, and they were murdered. So we know their art. People like Charlotte Salomon, people like Felix Nussbaum, and many others who were victims of Auschwitz. We need to remember, when we look at the artwork created that are presented here in the Forbidden Art exhibition, that this collection cannot be fully representative to the, for example, the differences in the population in the concentration camp, because of a different ideological patterns for Polish prisoners or non-Jewish prisoners, and also Jews, in terms of when they arrived in Auschwitz, in terms of what was their jobs initially. That, for example, many of the prisoners who came in those first transports received some jobs in the administration, in offices, because simply the SS needed to start running them then. We need to remember that in the world of this anti-Semitic ideology, which was also implemented in the concentration camp, the possibilities for Jewish inmates were much more limited in this regard. So of course, here in the Forbidden Art, we also can see some artworks of Jewish prisoners. We have more of them in our collections, but we may assume that much more Jewish prisoners who could create art either didn't survive because of the camp reality, or the artworks didn't survive because it was much more risky to get engaged in some kind of activity like this, which was in fact resistance, which was forbidden, for which you could be punished. When you look at the Forbidden Art exhibition, you can see that this is designed as some kind of a wooden barracks, which is important for the architecture of the camp, and every artwork is in its own individual window. And I believe this is a very good way of looking at this exhibition, that every artwork, every single work, can be considered, first of all, as a piece of art. And pieces of art are in a gallery, but you walk from one to another, and actually every one of them is telling a different story. And here we have exactly the same thing. When you look around this, when you go from one panel to another panel, read one story and then another story, you can see that every single one of them is opening a kind of a new window to understanding of what Auschwitz was. So when you stand in front of a portrait, it's a different story than if you stand at the piece of a drawing showing prisoners that basically resign, and they are exhausted and they are starving and they're basically giving up. Or when you look at some of the amazing artworks that were created by prisoners to thank some of the civilians from the outside who tried to help them, and then as a sign of a thank you are trying to give them something. Or when we look at the portraits of a female prisoner who in the portrait looks exactly like she looked like before the war, or even more beautiful, because the artist wanted them to be depicted in this human way, some kind to contradict the dehumanization. We can find illegal art documenting the crimes. We can find some of the little sculptures that were also done. So there are different kinds of art created in the camp. All of this forbidden, but actually every single one of them is a different story, is a different chapter, and you can treat them individuality as an artwork. You can interpret it in a different way. You can look how it was done, how big or small it was, what are the techniques that the artists were using, and the fact that every face of a prisoner in the lines of prisoners that he presented is another fingerprint. You can look at the world of Auschwitz through so many different eyes and so many different sensitivities, and I think this is the value of this exhibition, the power of this exhibition, that it allows us to take every single piece that is presented here, and people can reflect on them individuality, but when they are here, they kind of create kind of a chorus of voices that tell us a little bit more about this world of Auschwitz. And something that is indeed a challenge is that people, when they come to see this exhibition, for most of them, this will be a surprise. This will be the first shock. And then, thanks to this, they can understand a little bit more about what those people saw, what those people felt, what others felt, what was the human dimension of suffering, what was the human dimension of hope and different emotions in the tragic world of Auschwitz. Auschwitz Memorial is visited by over 2 million people every year. And we guide them, we teach them, we educate them about the story, they commemorate, they try to find some universal lessons from this human event from over 70 years ago. It also means that there is billions of people who will never be able to come to Auschwitz. They will never be able to have this experience. And we need to find ways to reach people in the world with the story of Auschwitz. So this is one of many traveling exhibitions that we have created as the memorial. This is one of the most interesting ones because it's not a typical panel exhibition that people are used to, that you have simply some kind of roll-ups and very simple stands where this exhibition can be moved very easily. Here it's a little bit more difficult because of this design, but we build it like this so that the design of the exhibition could have a little impact on their own. And the fact that it travels really allows people from many different places to see this art, to see those photographs or artifacts, to learn through them about the story of Auschwitz and to feel a little bit of the authenticity, because they can, of course, see the photographs, but they can look at the objects and artworks that are basically not presented, even to the visitors of the Auschwitz Memorial. We know that presentation of art is, from the conservation point of view, difficult, especially when this is art made on paper. And this will be the problem of every art gallery in the world because of the conservation requirements, that some of the drawings cannot be presented very long time, or the light restrictions are very strict. Here the situation is even more complicated because those pieces of art were not created on proper paper or proper canvas and paints, but sometimes prisoners had either some office paper that they managed to steal, or even pieces of cement bags or anything else that they could draw on. The materials that they also had is not proper paints or pencils. Sometimes it's just a little bit of plaster that they managed to scratch from the walls, and many other materials. And this is why it's also interesting when you look at the descriptions to read something that in an art gallery we usually don't read. Human interaction with art is a very intimate process. So on one hand, I don't feel in the position that I should tell people what to feel and what to experience here, because they will probably have their own answers, and these answers will be numerous. There will be no one reaction. But I think that on one hand, I hope that people who visit this exhibition will be able to see another dimension of the story of Auschwitz, that there is a chapter of Auschwitz that they didn't know, and that there is a chapter of the story of Auschwitz that really can give us a better and different and maybe even more profound and human understanding, because art is a way that people communicate from the very beginning. We, of course, have testimonies or documents, but documents and testimonies are difficult because they are always given in one language. A person tells a testimony in the language that he understands, and then translating it always loses something of the message, because a testimony is not only the words but also the voice, also the tone, also the emotions that are there. So we think art is this new way or different way of telling the story of Auschwitz, which is very universal in terms of the language. Because no matter if you are from here, from Philadelphia, or you are from West or East Coast, or from the United States, or you will have visitors from any other country, art is universal. And this is the huge value, that it doesn't tell the story with words, but with emotions, images that really interact individually with our imagination. So this is certainly one thing I would like people to look at this exhibition. Certainly it helps you to understand the complicated story of Auschwitz, because you will see life of prisoners, you can see extermination. So those different aspects of historical world of Auschwitz are also presented there. But I think this exhibition also may help people to understand or to reflect a little bit more on their own responsibility today. Because first of all, artist is always a viewer, a bystander, a person who sees and a person who reacts with art. And we are also people who live in our world and we see things with our own eyes. And as bystanders, sometimes we also have to react. Here we have, of course, victims, people who were in prisons, but as artists, they were bystanders to evil around them, and they chose to risk their lives so that we could take a look at these artworks today and tomorrow and in the future, and to get something from their sensitivity, and this is how they filtered this world. So on one way, this is also something important, but some of the works of art here touch another part of the story of bystanders, because some of the works of art in this exhibition were specifically created by prisoners to thank people who were outside of the isolated zone of the camp, who were bystanders of their suffering and who found motivation in their lives to do something to help people in need. And this kind of gesture that those prisoners who are suffering enormously behind the barbed wire, but they want to say thank you to people who thought about them, is something remarkable. And this story, outside of this exhibition, and when you tell about the context of some of the art of some of the workers, is very important. And when we talk about the story of the bystanders, when we analyze why those people, and very often they were, for example, very young people, and their parents asked them to do something, or the whole family was engaged. And we learn the story of those bystanders who, when they witnessed evil at their doorstep, near their fields or near their houses, they found motivation to do something for others. This is one of the most important universal lessons we can get from the story of Auschwitz. Of course, we learn horrible things about hateful ideology, of what can hatred and what ideologies of supremacy of one group over another can bring. Auschwitz is an ultimate and very extreme warning of this. But the story of this encounter of bystanders and prisoners and people who decided to risk their lives to help is this amazing story of human moral responsibility. And if there is something we should search in ourselves when we look at those artworks, is also the moral responsibility in ourselves today. Because we see things, and then the question is, what do we do with this? I think there are many, many questions we can ask ourselves after we visit a place like the Auschwitz Memorial, or when we come to see the exhibition like this. But I think one of the questions we really want people to think of is, what can I do today to make my world a little bit better place? And it starts with this. And of course, we often say, never again, we shouldn't repeat genocide. This is a very challenging goal. And actually, we can see that it happened again, that ideologies of hatred existed, and they exist today, and they probably will still exist. So sometimes it can sound like an utopian goal, especially for an individual, especially for a young person who sometimes says, what can I do? But if we start from finding motivation in ourselves to do step one, to do the first step, to simply think about another human being and do something for them, it can lead to step two and then step three, and it can become a habit. I remember I guided a married couple, Canadian Jewish people, who visited the memorial, and we were talking about it at the end. And the lady said something that I will remember, and I told her, I'm going to borrow this into way I educate, because she said, when I talk to my children today, and of course we live in this crazy time when everyone is so busy and we're living in such a quick way, and then she tells her children, this is what she told me, that I tell my kids, when you're too busy, when you don't have time to do something good for another human being. And if you notice this, it's time to reevaluate how you live your life. I think this is also, accept all those historical messages that we can get from this story. Thinking about our role today is a very important way. And if we, asking ourselves this question, what can I do to make the world better today is, I think, a very profound way of commemorating all the people who suffered in places like Auschwitz.